The Reiki symbols are one of the most misunderstood parts of the whole system. Now, most people are introduced to the symbols as if they're mysterious objects with some kind of built-in power. You see them presented as tools for healing, protection, manifestation, and everything in between. And once that idea takes hold, the whole thing starts to drift away from what the system actually is. Because Reiki itself isn't a collection of techniques, it's a discipline of awareness. And if you don't understand that, then the symbols are almost guaranteed to be misunderstood. So let's strip this right back to the core point. Reiki symbols are meditation devices. They're used to stabilize attention, deepen awareness, and develop concentration. That's their primary function. Everything else people say about them either builds on that or moves very far away from it. And the reason this matters is because the moment you treat them as tools that do something, you've already started from the wrong place. You're focusing on outcome instead of process. You're trying to use the system instead of actually practicing it. Now, in most modern Reiki teaching, you'll come across 4 forms: Chokure, Seiheki, Honshize Shinen, and Deikomyo. And they're usually grouped together as if they're all the same type of thing. But they're not. There's a structural distinction here that most people never get told, and it changes how you work with them completely. Chokure and Seiheki are abstract forms. They're not written language. They don't represent words or phrases. They're constructed shapes that you use as objects of focus. Because they don't carry linguistic meaning, they don't pull the mind into interpretation. You don't have to translate anything. You don't have to think about what they mean. You bring your attention directly into contact with the form and you stabilize it there. That's what makes them powerful as meditation tools, not because they contain something, but because they don't. They allow the mind to settle without being dragged back into thinking. You're not working with meaning, you're working with structure. And that lets attention stabilize much more cleanly. The other two are very different. Honshize Shinen and Deikomyo are Japanese kanji. They are written language. They carry meaning, and that meaning plays a role in how you work with them. So instead of just stabilizing attention through form, you're also directing attention through meaning. So you've got 2 different mechanisms operating within the same system. One that stabilizes attention without concepts, and one that introduces direction through meaning. And if you ignore that distinction and treat all 4 as if they're the same, you flatten the system. You lose the precision that's built into it, and from that point on, you're just repeating forms without actually developing anything. And that's why you can see people using symbols for years and not going any deeper. Repetition on its own doesn't produce depth, it produces habit. Now, there's another layer of confusion that sits on top of this, which is where people start talking about Sanskrit. You'll hear it all of the time, that Reiki symbols come from the Sanskrit language, or that they were originally Sanskrit symbols that got passed down. That explanation has been repeated for years, and it isn't accurate. Chokure and Seiheki aren't derived from any written language at all. They're constructed forms. Honshize Shinen and Deikomyo are Japanese kanji. They belong to a Japanese linguistic framework. The Sanskrit explanation didn't come from the forms themselves. It came from incorrect teaching that just got repeated and accepted without being questioned. Most people don't know Sanskrit outside of India. They don't know Japanese. So when they're told something like that, they just accept it. And over time, repetition turns that into fact. But more importantly, that kind of explanation pushes the symbols into the realm of mystery. It makes them feel ancient and hidden and special in a way that encourages projection instead of practice. Instead of working with them directly, people start imagining what they are. And once that happens, they stop functioning properly. You see a similar thing with the Mount Karama story. People will say that Mikaru Sui, the founder of the Reiki system, saw the Reiki symbols during his experience there as if they were revealed to him fully formed. That version just doesn't hold up. The more consistent versions of the account describe light symbolic forms, sometimes linked to Sanskrit or Siddham, but not the specific symbols that are taught today. The idea that he received the Reiki symbols as they are now presented is a later interpretation. It's another example of people projecting the current system back onto an earlier story. And again, it shifts attention away from the practice and towards explanation. So if we come back to what the symbols actually do, the simplest way to understand it is this: they stabilize attention. That's it. In practice, you draw the symbol, you focus on it, you internalize it, and you return your attention to it repeatedly. It becomes a fixed point that interrupts the usual movement of the mind. Instead of being carried away by thought, attention comes back to the same form again and again. With the abstract symbols, that happens without triggering interpretation. With the kanji forms, it happens through both form and meaning, but in both cases, the direction is inward. You're not projecting anything outward. You're refining your own state of awareness. And as that stabilization deepens, perception changes. Attention becomes less reactive, less fragmented, less dependent on external input. You start to see how experience is actually being formed. That's the developmental function of the symbols. Now, you will see them used in a healing context. That's part of how Reiki is expressed in the world, but their role there is secondary and often overstated. If you understand the symbols primarily as tools you use in a treatment, you've already misunderstood them. You've shifted the focus outward. You've moved into trying to produce results instead of stabilizing awareness, and that changes everything. It totally reinforces the idea that you need to do something, that you need to make something happen, that you're in control of the outcome. It pulls attention away from observation and back into activity. And over time, that doesn't deepen practice, it prevents it. The same misunderstanding is what leads to people creating more and more symbols. Once you treat symbols as tools for producing effects, it seems logical that more symbols will give you more results. So people start inventing new ones, adding layers, expanding the system. But that doesn't create depth. It just creates distraction. Depth comes from staying with a small number of forms and allowing them to develop, not from constantly moving on to something new. And this is where you get the claim that any symbols will work. People say you can create your own symbols or use anything and it will still work. And in a very limited sense, they're not completely wrong. Certain shapes do stabilize attention. Form does influence perception. But that doesn't make all symbols equivalent. That's where the logic completely breaks down. They're confusing effect with meaning. Just because something produces a sensation doesn't mean it has the same place within a structured system. Reiki symbols aren't arbitrary. They have a defined role within a method. Remove that structure and they lose their meaning within the system. If any symbol were truly equivalent, then the system itself wouldn't matter. And at that point, it stops being Reiki. So when you bring all of this together, the picture becomes really clear. Reiki symbols are not objects with power. They are not tools for manipulating energy. They are not techniques for producing outcomes. They are precise, structured devices for training attention and stabilizing awareness. If you use them in that way, they become extremely effective. If you don't, they become decorative shapes that people project meaning onto. And the difference between those two is the difference between practicing the system and just imitating it.